Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for Aliya Rao's book talk, Crunch Time, How Married Couples Confront Unemployment. It's great to see you all here today. I'm Allison Crossley, the Executive Director of the Clayman Institute for Gender Research. Since 1974, the Institute has conducted intersectional gender research, has brought together interdisciplinary communities of scholars, and has endeavored to translate gender research to broad audiences. We have fellowships and internships for Stanford undergraduates, graduate students, and faculty. And we have a brand new program for Stanford graduate students called Heteropatriarchy and Academia. We host many events pertaining to gender and intersectionality that are open to all. Our book talk today is part of a series of book talks celebrating Clayman Institute authors. Our next book talk is on April 12th. Clayman Institute Research Fellow Susan Krieger will present her new book, Are You Two Sisters? The Journey of a Lesbian Couple. Please see our website for more information and where you can also sign up for our newsletter. Before I introduce our speaker, a few programming notes. Aliya will speak about her book, and I'll offer up a few thoughts and a question afterwards, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. For questions, you can either use the chat function to type out your question, which I will then read, or you can raise your hand and I will call on you and you can ask your question yourself. This event is being recorded and live captioned, and after the event, we'll send you a link to the recording if you'd like to share it. Now to introduce our speaker. Aliya Rao is an assistant professor in the Department of Methodology at the London School of Economics. She completed her PhD in sociology at the University of Pennsylvania and was a postdoctoral fellow at the Clayman Institute. Her research interests span the study of work and organizations, family, gender, economic sociology, and emotions. Aliya's research has been published in peer-reviewed journals such as Sociological Methods and Research, Journal of Marriage and Family, and Industrial and Labor Relations Review. Aliya's research has also been covered in outlets such as the Financial Times, the New York Times, and Huffington Post. She has written for The Atlantic, Harvard Business Review, and Quartz, and also Aliya contributed to the Clayman Institute's Gender and Pandemics series. It's so nice to welcome Aliya back to the Clayman Institute. She contributed so much to our intellectual community during her 2 years with us. We also held a manuscript workshop for this book while she was a postdoc, which I remember fondly as it was in person and with a great group of scholars. So it is wonderful to be at this point to celebrate Aliya's finished book. Thank you so much, Aliya, for joining us today. Over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction, Allison, and thank you for having me here today. I'm really delighted to be presenting this book and this talk here at the Clayman Institute in particular, because as Allison pointed out, the bulk of the book was really kind of, worked through and written during my postdoctoral fellowship at the Clayman Institute. And this included the book conference, which was invaluable for kind of getting to the book to the final product, basically. But it was also, it was really from the beginning, from the prospectus onwards, developing that happened during my postdoctoral fellowship to sort of writing the first draft. So it's really a pleasure to be presenting this talk here in particular. So to get started, let me just share my slideshow with you. Just a sec. Okay, so to get started with the talk, what I'd like to do is I'd like to take you back about 13 years ago or so. What you see on the screen in front of you are headlines from the Great Recession, when our world was sort of lost rocked in such a very massive way by economic destruction, including unemployment. At the time, I had recently finished my undergraduate degree, and I was entering the world of paid work at a very acutely uncertain time in recent history. I was doing an internship at the International Labour Organization in Geneva, Switzerland, where we talked about things like safety nets and decent work, while all around the world, people were losing jobs. With this background, I want to share how I think this book really is in some ways a product of what sociologist C. Wright Mills would have called when personal biography meets social structure, where my initial and very formative entrance into the world of paid work occurred at a particularly tumultuous time. The sheer uncertainty of everything really stuck with me. And in many ways, I think this book is an exploration of uncertainty. Let me explain what I mean. Sociologists often see uncertainty as a potentially productive time when new norms, new ways of behaving, new ways of understanding can arise. Some scholars of gender, for instance, have posited how unemployment, especially men's, may be a time when norms around gendered beliefs and behaviors can be revised, potentially to be more gender egalitarian. For instance, the idea is that in couples, the division of paid and unpaid work may often be explained by who earns more, and for various reasons, this is usually men. And so the idea would be that when men don't have jobs, that may catalyze a more gender egalitarian division of housework, because a key basis for why men don't do housework has been removed. So this study and this book really arose out of a personal and intellectual curiosity about the generative potential of the time of uncertainty, unemployment, essentially in people's lives. How do people understand it? What kinds of changes, especially in terms of gender equality, in the family does unemployment mean? Does it foster this? To cut a long story short, what I find is that unemployment reinforces gender inequalities. And what I'll share with you today in the talk is a bit about how this reinforcement happens. So let me give you an example of a glimpse into what I mean. I'll start by sharing the experience of one unemployed man and one unemployed woman. These examples should give you a taste of what the overall findings will be, which I'll also go into more detail. So Darlene Buck, and again, all names that I draw on here are pseudonyms. Darlene Buck lost her job as a high-ranking marketing executive 4 months ago. But she's surprisingly cheerful when I met her, feeling like, as she says, a superwoman, because she has been able to, she says, do the things that I didn't have time to do before, like participate more in my teenage son's school things. I felt really happy about it because it's like, this is what it is like to be a stay-at-home mom. At $150,000 a year of base salary, Darlene's income had been 3 times as much as her husband Larry's. But when I spoke with Larry about his wife's unemployment, he said he's perfectly happy to have Darlene hang out and enjoy life. Darlene's experience is very different from Todd Barron's. The Barrons are having a difficult time. Todd lost his marketing job 5 months ago, 5 months before I interviewed him. His wife, Kimmy, also works. But instead of feeling like a Superman like Darlene did, Todd has been morose. His 5'9" frame stoops, his eyes dart around, and he fidgets, constantly rubbing his middle finger against his thumb. Kimmy has been worried about him, saying that she talked him out of doing something rash, ending his life or something. Todd's unemployment strikes both him and his family hard. Instead of enjoying time with his family at home, like Darlene talks about doing, Todd is focused on finding a job as quickly as possible. Kimmy too thinks this is very important. Unlike Larry, who is relaxed about Darlene's job searching, Kimmy is exasperated with Todd. Rolling her eyes, Kimmy describes Todd as, he's like a sit on your hands, let the other shoe drop kind of guy. So Darlene and Todd, when I interviewed them, were among millions of college-educated Americans experiencing unemployment. The US Bureau of Labor Statistics noted that approximately 90% of college-educated workers can expect to experience at least one spell of unemployment. Most will experience more. Their higher levels of education and credentialing no longer protect these workers from unemployment as they did in decades past. But how is it that comparable men and women like Darlene and Todd, both college educated, married professionals with children, come to have such different experiences of unemployment? So in this talk today, what I'll do is I'll show you what goes on in marriages and at home to produce such divergent responses to unemployment. So just to kind of recap, what research before sort of tells us, prior research examining unemployment, including whether it catalyzes gender equality in couples, has sort of tended to focus only on men's unemployment. And I really thought when I was working on this project that a comparison with women would be very important in order to make claims about what unemployment means to men and women and to their families, how gendered processes play a part, and how unemployment is then experienced at an individual and at a couple level. This is because men's and women's roles as husbands and wives, fathers and mothers, place them in varied relationship with employment. So employment has been central to the dominant or hegemonic conception of masculinity in the US. That is, to be a good dad or to be a good husband, a man is expected to typically provide economically. But dominant conceptions, in contrast though, employment has been sort of framed as butting heads with motherhood. dominant conceptions of motherhood in the US, even though these are changing, frame women's employment as an obstacle to ideal notions of very intensive mothering. So what I did is I designed a study to understand this experience of contemporary unemployment amongst the professional middle class in the US. And I'm happy to talk more about what the professional middle class means, but for now I'll sort of move on. I recruited participants for the study from the Northeast of the US, and my inclusion criteria required participants to be heterosexual, married, dual earner, college educated with dependent children, where one partner is unemployed. And my participants came from a range of occupations such as lawyers, chemists, and marketing and management professionals. I conducted interviews with 25 unemployed men and 23 unemployed women, and interviews with about half their spouses. I also conducted follow-up interviews about at least 6 months after the first interview with about half the total sample. And then finally, I spent time conducting intensive family observations with 4 families, 2 of unemployed men and 2 of unemployed women. And what the family observation really meant was that I basically hung out with these families for a period of 2 to 3 weeks, usually visiting them daily for anywhere from 2 to 8 hours. So I helped one family paint their house. I went on a road trip with another family that lasted like for 10 hours, so the better part of a day. I went to birthday parties, to school plays, visits to the zoo, to the library, and so on. Just trying to understand, my purpose in doing this was to understand what does unemployment, how does it shape the sort of daily rhythm of family life? So just to give you a sense of, these are, I said they're professional middle class. These were relatively affluent families. They had comfortable homes in sort of, rich, wealthy neighborhoods. And this is not the house of any of the families I interviewed or observed, but just to give you a sense of the social class status of these families. Okay. So just an overview of the broader findings to get us going. Although unemployment, like I said earlier, could be generative in terms of indicating the potential for more gender egalitarian norms and practices in families, my findings in this book do not suggest such an optimistic picture. Overall, I find that in families with unemployed men, men's income is emphasized and their job searching is consequently prioritized. There's a tremendous expectation that men will focus on job searching and that they will demonstrate this intent focus to their wives. Men do so, and wives help them by organizing men's time around their job searching, which also buys men out of the obligation to do housework. It also means that men receive space in the home dedicated to job searching, such as the creation of a new home office or upgrading an already existing home office. In contrast, in families of unemployed women, there is no such understanding that the loss of a woman's income is detrimental to household finances. And so there's consequently a minimal expectation that women should focus on job searching. Women's days are not organized around job searching. In fact, the expectation that women have of themselves and that their husbands have as well is that women will take over most of the housework. The idea being that they're unemployed, so they'll do that. Women also do not receive a space of their own, to job search from. I just want to point out one intriguing aspect of these sort of very disparate approaches is that they're not economically rational. So unemployed men, regardless of what proportion of household income they provided, are sort of exhorted to focus on job searching. In families where women are unemployed, like we saw with the Darlene Bach example earlier, families are relaxed, even when women had been the primary earners, like Darlene was. So my findings indicate that the potential of unemployment as a time of uncertainty to generate more gender egalitarian norms and behaviors is really not realized, at least not for this group of people. And I think that's an important caveat, the social class sort of constraint here, that for this group of people, it's not leading to more gender egalitarian behaviors, essentially. So let's get a little bit more into the findings themselves. So first is how sort of job loss is framed and understood within a family. So with men, what happens is that there's couples sort of perceive men's unemployment and consequent decrease in household income as relative deprivation, the loss of material and cultural goods that otherwise accompany a social class status. So a communications professional in his late 40s Robert Jansen, a white man, had steadily earned a comfortable six-figure income. His wife, Laura, who was also white, worked in media and earned similarly. They'd been married for 5 years. They had a 4-year-old daughter and a 2-year-old son. Both Laura and Robert shared the perception that Robert's unemployment had deprived them of living a life commensurate with their social class status. By his follow-up interview, after a year of unemployment, Robert was reemployed in a similar position as the one he had lost. He described his unemployment. So he's reflecting back on this and he's saying, I think I felt a little bit like our life was on hold. In her follow-up interview, Laura also explained, we can start living our lives now. We're not waiting to see if Robert gets a job. We're not waiting for anything. Couples in the study felt that men's unemployment denied them the ability to live an appropriate lifestyle based on what they saw as their social class status. So what happens with women? How is it understood in the families? How is their job loss understood in the families of unemployed women? One example is Grace Bloom, a white woman who had worked in the public sector. She was in her early 40s and married to Finn, a white public sector lawyer. They had 2 elementary school-aged daughters. Before she lost her job, Grace and Finn had each brought in about $70,000 a year. But neither of Grace's job loss results in like half the household income sort of going away, just like Robert's did. But neither Grace nor Finn emphasized that Grace needed a job to enable their prior lifestyle. Grace says, we live very modestly. We always thought it important that we could keep our house on one income. Now that one income is Finn's. Grace explained how her staying at home while unemployed saved them money. She says, the plus side of me being home is that we don't have to pay for aftercare, which is $300 per month. And we didn't have to pay for summer camp, which could be $2,000 to $5,000 per kid. She quickly added, not that it evens out by any means, but the bigger point here is that instead of thinking in terms of relative deprivation, not being able to afford the trappings of their social class, and summer camp for their daughters could be such a trapping. These couples framed the loss of women's income in sort of very pared down needs, not in terms of relative deprivation. Okay, so going on to gendered time during unemployment, the dominant experience for men in the study was to structure their days to maximize job searching. So Terry Clark described job searching as shaping his days, and he says, it's fairly structured. It's important to mitigate the risks of wasting time. I spend at least Monday through Thursday searching several websites using predefined searches I have. Wives of unemployed men expected their husbands to approximate Terry's laser-focused commitment, where job searching itself became, as they said, like a job. They emphasized that their priority was job searching, and they referenced their ostensible natural incapability to do housework too. When I asked Terry about the division of housework, for instance, asking that if you're unemployed, does that mean you do more chores and so on? And he shrugged it off, saying, I'm home to find a job. I'm not home to do that. I think, just to go back, but I think one of the most acute examples of protecting men's time was how couples managed childcare. So in this study, and again, this is a small non-random qualitative sample, 10 of the 25 men had at least one child who was not yet kindergarten aged. Out of these 10, once men lost their jobs, only 3 families made extensive changes to childcare arrangements, which directly relied on unemployed men. In the remaining 7 families, what happened was that men often took on more childcare responsibilities than they had before. For example, doing more pickups and drop-offs, but they did not become primarily responsible. Okay, so moving on to women. And how women spend their time when they're unemployed. So one example is Cheryl Stanley, a white woman who lost her job a year ago. Cheryl had earned about the same as her husband, but she was pretty resentful as she described how she felt pushed into the role of, in her terms, Hannah homemaker. So Cheryl says, my husband would take more turn doing things. He would help with the dinner, meals, or cleaning. Now that I'm not working, it's not even the realm of even anything he's thinking about. He doesn't think about, well, maybe he could help clean the bathrooms, or he could run the vacuum, or he could do some shopping. Women's unemployment sort of marked a focal point when husbands expected that all housework would be women's responsibility. Another example of this is Eileen Boyle, and Eileen lost her job after 27 years with one company. And she says, now I get up, take the kids to school because neither of them likes the bus in the morning, and that's just something we fell into doing. I pick my daughter up from school. If she's working, I get her to work. Depending on what shift she's working, there are times I'll just bring my laptop and hang out in the cafe and do job searches, send out resumes, applications, that sort of thing. I think it's really important to note that Eileen had been the primary earner in her family, and she'd made about $100,000 a year in comparison to her husband's $30,000 a year. Her job clearly matters economically to her family, but her job search was very fragmented, split up, sort of, it wasn't the focus of her day. Her day wasn't organized around it. So one of the last dimensions that I want to sort of talk about is this, what happens with the use of space during unemployment. And I feel like, especially during COVID, I think we've seen this happen as well in terms of how with parents working at home at the same time, who sort of, gets the office and who gets like the kitchen table, for instance. So what I saw in these couples experiencing unemployment was that with men, as part of prioritizing men's job searching, and by prioritizing this by directing resources to facilitate job searching, often what this meant was that a section of the house would be demarcated as out of bounds and saved for the primary use of the unemployed man as he searched for a job. So the Jansons, a white couple, the ones we met earlier, told their 4-year-old daughter that daddy goes to work in the basement so that she would not disturb Robert during his working or job searching hours at 8:30 a.m. To 4 p.m. It's important to note that, in fact, the Jansons, for instance, like many other families, also retained their childcare arrangements that they'd had prior to the husband's job loss. So with Robert, for instance, when he's in the basement, there's a full-time nanny who comes in and looks after the 2 kids. Again, the idea being that Robert needs to have as much time as he can unobstructed to search for a job, because that really ought to be his focus. He needs to sort of, be doing that. That's the kind of understanding in the family. Another example of this is Todd, the unemployed man that we met at the beginning as an example. And he explains how he and his wife, Kimmy, decided to invest in building a home office to help him with job searching. This took money. He describes what the home office really meant. And he says, we did like my little office. It's actually part of the living room. We put up a wall because the living room was pretty big and we weren't going to ever use it. So we took up almost half of it and put a wall up and put up like a little door for my office. So we put in a new carpet, we painted, so we spent some money. So it's important to note that with Todd and Kimmy, they're really directing quite a bit of money into building this home office, again, so that Todd can work undisturbed. This is important for them because they have three sons under the age of 10 who are, as they describe it, quite noisy and boisterous, but they deem it very important that Todd should have the space to be able to search for a job where he can sort of go in and shut himself off and not be disturbed by kids. That shouldn't get in the way of his job searching. But the other thing also is that Kimmy also talked about how that home office was useful for her, because otherwise she would be seeing what he wasn't doing. That if he was out in the open, she would have seen that he wasn't searching for a job. Just a reminder, she called him like he's a, sit on your hands and let the other shoe drop kind of guy. So she felt like he didn't have enough hustle, essentially, to search for a job. And for her, that was very problematic. So she was like, no, at least this closing of the door, I can assume that he's searching for a job, even if that's not what he's doing. So it served as sort of psychological function, this kind of barrier of protecting wives also at times a little bit from worrying about their husbands. Okay, so what happens? Oh, sorry. Excuse me. What happens in families of unemployed women? There, rather than demarcating a sort of sacrosanct space for job searching, unemployed women job searched whenever and wherever they could. So, earlier I talked about how Eileen Boyle talks about, like, she might kind of work at the cafe where her daughter works, just kind of sending out resumes and so on. Darlene Bach, who we also met earlier, frequently applied to jobs as she waited for her son Parker at his extracurricular activities. Now, because I observed Darlene's family on one such occasion, my field notes I wrote after one such visit, and this is when like Darlene was taking Parker to his private squash lesson. So my field notes say, Darlene sits down in the white mini bleachers right by Parker's squash court. She keeps an eye on him, looking up every now and then. But she's also brought along her laptop. She has a small internet hotspot device. She places this next to her and opens her laptop to resume work on an incomplete online job application. She intermittently glances up at the glassed-in court where Parker is sullenly practicing with his coach. So again, what this means is that couples did not typically create a special space to facilitate women's job searching. In fact, during an observational visit to the Bach family, I was chatting with Darlene's son Parker, and he said to me, my mom's home all the time now, and she doesn't bother getting her own desk. She just like comes into my room and just takes all of the stuff off my desk and just shoves it somewhere and then just uses it as her work desk. Because job searching was not paramount for couples with an unemployed woman, the other thing was that they did not need to regulate their interactions around it. So there, again, because in Darlene's family, she wasn't trying to prove how hard she's trying to find a job and so on to her husband, there was no need to kind of shut herself off into a separate, office and kind of focus on job searching. Another thing that happened was that with women with younger children, so children less than 6 years old here, what I saw was that women would also often talk about, but if my child is at home with me, it's a very fragmented job search because I'm waiting to see if they're taking a nap. I'm feeding them something. I'm just always so it's like in between a nap, in between the next feeding, that's when I might fill out chunks of an online application, but it's not like I have a sit down time to kind of just dedicate to job searching. So again, the point being that unemployed women didn't have the time or the space to organize their days, to organize their routine while unemployed around job searching. So I want to end with news headings from the last couple of years. And basically since the COVID-19 pandemic started, these news headlines sort of seem to me eerily like the news headlines of 13 years ago or so. When it comes to a time of uncertainty, including economic, the start of the COVID-19 pandemic really presented another sort of moment of rupture, a moment when social infrastructure could be reconsidered and rebuilt. 2 years on, the potential of that moment to catalyze social change that acknowledges the realities of paid work in our context of precarity remains under-realized. So perhaps as our discussion progresses today, we can think about the implications of economic changes, of economic devastations, which are really not rare and far in between, but we can think about them for gender inequality in this sort of particular moment as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Aliya. Virtual claps for this great talk, and thank you for sharing this incredible research that is so timely in many ways. I'm going to share a few thoughts and then I will kick off our Q&A. The research questions and methods in this book are so creative, I think. When I think about unemployment, I think about the absence of being in a workplace or the absence of being on Zoom all day for those who can work from home. I think about economic precarity and social safety nets. But from this work, we learn how important it is to understand the home as a place where meaning about work and unemployment is made, where the job search physically takes place, and where gendered family dynamics shape and are shaped by the job search. This book really makes the experience of unemployment come alive, and we can see how dramatically it affects the entire household. And it really bridges a number of different areas of research, which I found such an engaging read. We learn about work, the home, paid work and unpaid work, emotion, family, and marriage. I was especially interested in the ideal job seeker contribution in the book. The ideal worker norm is that of the devoted full-time worker who is wholly committed to work at the expense of family and personal responsibilities, which are then most often supported by women and wives or outsourced to other women. In most areas of our country, outsourced to women of color. And the extension of this ideal worker norm in this book, the ideal job seeker, makes perfect sense that the ideal worker wouldn't just evaporate with unemployment. And what I think this book does so well is show that the ideal job seeker, like the ideal worker, relies not only on total devotion to finding a job, the daddies downstairs finding a job, but essential to this are the overlooked and invisible work of women who are supporting the job seeking, taking care of the family, feeding, and chores, oftentimes at the expense of their own careers. I also found it fascinating how important it was in this research that unemployed men were repackaged into ideal job seekers to ward off the gendered stigma of being an unemployed man. And there was this conceptual and emotional labor that was done on the part of both husbands and wives in this research to uphold and confirm masculinity, even in the face of unemployment. The ideal job seeker norm and how it functions in an everyday gendered way is exemplary of the contributions in this entire book, which is really making the invisible visible. There is a long tradition of feminists and gender scholars centering the home or intimate relationships, oftentimes making visible the unpaid labor and emotional labor that is imperative and that also reproduces family life and subsequently reproduces inequalities. Because the home is both difficult to conduct research inside of, and because it is seen as a private place, this allows gender inequality to remain unchecked. But making the invisible visible, as Crunch Time does, not only highlights the work of women that oftentimes goes unrecognized, but it also reveals the interplay between families and the structure and broader social forces that we may not understand so deeply. While it is important in and of itself, of course, to understand gender and racial hierarchies played out in the home, as Crunch Time does with such nuance, the book also shows how much of family life and the challenges of raising children, for example, are in many ways solely an individual pursuit for families in the US. With few safety nets and precarious work on the rise, the familial experience of unemployment can really be seen in a new light with this research. For example, because there was no easy option for affordable childcare for some of these families, even as they are economically and racially privileged, this coupled with rigid traditional gender norms in these homes, we can see that women may take longer getting back on their feet financially after unemployment because childcare in many of these families is expected to be the woman's responsibility, unemployed or not. And we see the same with housework, which it seems that many of the men in the study thought of as a biological trait or skill. The layers of gender inequality are thus apparent in gendered interactions and hierarchy in the home on an individual level, and in systems that don't support women and families on a structural level. And because this research is based on spending so much time with families in their homes, which is just really incredible, the observations that were revealed throughout the book, we can see how inequality is produced and reproduced in some under the radar ways. Even in the home, which is seen as a woman's domain traditionally, we see the man's need reign supreme in job seeking and in the rearrangement of most of the other family life. When homes are seen as sacred, private places where research does not take place, we do not then see how inequalities are perpetuated in them. And we also miss a big picture of how economic changes like unemployment are experienced in the home and thus fuel inequality. Without this type of gender research done in Crunch Time and shedding light on the inequality within the home, we would not understand the full picture of the durability of gender inequality, which I really found to be a major takeaway from this book. I think sometimes there's a sense that gender and intersectional inequalities will change quickly, or that awareness of inequality will increase with each generation and then thus will open opportunities for more egalitarian relationships and just societies. And while I'm not completely pessimistic on this front, and there is some research that gives us a little optimism, overall, I think this book is a reality check in the sense that even in the most private places and even in racially and economically privileged families, with some research participants who also wish to have a more egalitarian household, gender inequality was experienced really by all of the women in this research. And their children also were watching and learning these gender norms themselves. So even during times of household upheaval like unemployment, when, for example, there would be room for the unemployed father to take on more domestic work, a time that seems ripe for change, the durability and perniciousness of gender inequality is revealed as gender norms become even more deeply entrenched in these families. So thank you so much, Aliya. That leads me to my first question, which is about really the pandemic, unemployment and gender. As your concluding slide showed, we are now seeing that the pandemic is rewinding perhaps generations of feminist gains. We are also experiencing dramatic inflation and the rise of housing costs, the she session. And I'm wondering, to kick off the question and answer session, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how your research helps us understand the current time period in terms of work, gender, and the family.
Sure. So one of the things that I've been, so sorry, like firstly, Allison, thank you so much for those comments. So like when I was listening to you speak, I was like, I feel like she's, so much more eloquent about the book than I can be. It was really nice to hear that. But what you're saying about like what this means for how this helps us understand the pandemic, it's something I've been thinking about a lot. And one of the things, like with the analysis that I do of the spatial division of the house, like that was the one thing that really sort of stuck with me with what we are seeing in the pandemic, especially with everyone working at home and really not having an out anywhere, that who gets the better space. And I'm thinking especially, I don't know if you followed like the New York Times, I think this was done by Jessica Bennett or Jessica Gross, I'm forgetting who, but they had that the series on rage, like mothers and rage, and one was like a sort of like photo essay on like where mothers are working. So you'd have like literally where they're taking conference calls from like a tiny bathroom, from a completely dark, tiny closet. But the fathers have offices, have like, if the mother has like a tiny closet, the father has like a large kitchen table. And I think to me, like, I think what it helps us understand, including with the she session, or the Great Resignation, or whatever you want to call it, is how some people's jobs just hold more symbolic, if not economic importance in the family. So I think like fathers do benefit from getting like a lot, in heterosexual families, I need to say, do benefit from getting access to a lot of resources. And today I talked about the access that they have to sort of time, which is protected from housework, from childcare, for job searching, the access they have to space. But another resource that they have access to is women's emotions, right? So they have access to like their wives' emotions, who are sort of buffering the pain of sort of losing a job and going on jobs and you're searching for jobs and getting rejected over and over again, where wives are sort of like, functioning almost as cheerleaders, sort of being like, you'll be fine, you'll get a job, carry on. That doesn't happen with unemployed women. In this study, at least, when women lost their jobs and were searching for a job, they didn't have husbands to talk to about that job search because it was seen as so not important. So part of me also wonders, like, in a context like that, when you're not sort of being encouraged or getting the support that emphasizes that your paid work also is important, that your career professional goals also are important. I think in a context like that, it's not especially surprising to me that we would see a she session. Also in a context where, like, with the pandemic, what we are seeing rather is the sheer number of, what this has meant for childcare in terms of who's taking over. Like, I think there's studies from the UK, from Canada, from the US, from Australia, one from Australia, which shows that school closures and the pandemic meant that there were 6 additional hours of unpaid work related to childcare, out of which mothers did 4. So yes, fathers stepped up in heterosexual families, they stepped up, but mothers are doing 4 more. Fathers are doing the other 2. Right? This is completely uneven. So I think it also shows, when you have those kind of constraints combined with the symbolic devaluation of your paid work in the family, to me, this doesn't seem very surprising what we are seeing, right? Like with the she session.
Yeah, thank you. It reminds me of that picture that went viral of the woman who was working with her computer, and you could just see something kind of professional, and then below the computer, it was just chaos with toys and just a mess. right? It really kind of brings that point home. Thank you, Aliya. Let's see in the chat. We have a couple of questions. Wendy asked, I noticed that your newspaper headlines are largely sourced from North America or Europe. What have you noticed about unemployment and gender in other cultures or locations in the world, such as China, Taiwan, India, South Asia, or the Middle East?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one I do not have a good answer for. And I'll tell you, like, this is a sort of personal pet peeve of mine. Like, why don't I have a good answer for this? When I started off this project, I really thought it was going to be comparative. So I'm from India, and I really wanted to kind of study Indian unemployment there, and that just wasn't possible for the the limitations of the dissertation. So I don't have a good response there, and I would not extrapolate, like, the places I would extrapolate this particular data for. I think it can help us understand family dynamics in countries that are very similar to the US. Now the US is very anomalous. But the only countries that are similar to it in a manner of speaking where this can be transferable, I would say Australia, I would say Canada, I would say the UK to an extent. Again, all of these countries offer usually more childcare support than the US does. But this is where I would say, I think these are the kind of mechanisms you can see, partly because we know from other people's research, not mine, that these ideologies of sort of intensive parenting, but also intensive motherhood also have a hold there. And also that in the absence of, these are the countries with sort of limited childcare support, as opposed to, say, like, Scandinavian countries and so on, that you could see these things play out. But the regions you're asking about, China, Taiwan, India, I think gender configuration is very different there. I would not extrapolate this study to any of those contexts at all. And I don't think I'm well equipped, based on my research, unfortunately, to be able to answer this very excellent question.
Okay, thank you. Carol asked, I think the really profound question is why so little has changed in the last 40 plus years since she did her dissertation fieldwork among families of nurses. This could be 1975 in Los Angeles. Same basic cultural model of family, daddy's work, mommy's help out.
I mean, I agree. I think that's a really good question. And, like, I think just to provide some background, when I started doing research for this book, that's a time when there was a whole, at least in sociology, right? Like, there was a whole kind of range of books coming out about this alternative cultural model of modern masculinity, right? So that you can have fathers whose fatherhood is predicated not on economic provision, but rather on sort of being hands-on dads. And so when I started the fieldwork, I was relatively, I have to say, agnostic, because it seemed like there was this alternative cultural model. So I was like, well, maybe that's what's happening. Maybe we are seeing that. And this is a way for me to kind of explore and examine that a little bit more. And I think since then, the research, quantitative and qualitative, has actually been pretty robustly saying, this alternative cultural model of fatherhood it's certainly not hegemonic, and it certainly seems to have limited appeal even amongst younger cohorts, right? So, like, Alison, to this idea of, like, what is happening with sort of a move towards gender equality, when it comes to pay and when it comes to, like, the division of paid and unpaid work and things like that. I think, on the one hand, I feel similarly, like, I feel positive about, like, I feel optimistic, because when you see how, the cohort sort of labeled is it Z? Gen Z, Gen Z, that they, because they have, like, access to a wider range of sex and gender and sexuality kind of, I guess, identities and so on. But at the same time, when you look at, like, when you ask them about their preferences, Gen Z and millennials especially, so not very old people, relatively young people who you would think we would assume have sort of progressive ideas, when you ask them what kind of family configuration or family structure, whatever they want, the most common one that they prefer is still the male earner, female carer, even when it comes to sort of people with more gender egalitarian perspectives. And this is a study amongst the millennials that I'm thinking of, gender egalitarian perspectives. What you find is that when they're confronted with institutional or structural obstacles, so let's say about maternity policy or whatever it might be, those kind of leave policies, men in particular, often, if they can't have egalitarian, they want a male breadwinner, female a carer model, and the women don't. The women want it to be equal, or let women work as earners, but the men don't want that. So I'm confused there also, because the data is not entirely clear on where we are with that and why this is continuing. But I think this is an important question. I think a lot of people are trying to figure this out, right? Like, why is this not shifting in a way we would expect it to? And I think my guess is it has something to do with like status, and the status that having this kind of a family structure, in particular, this male earner, female carer structure, what that affords you, that if you don't have that, you're sort of deviating from it. If you don't have a husband who's like earning, there's a bit of a stigma essentially to it. It's something that needs to be explained away in a way that a woman not earning doesn't need to be explained away to your neighbors or to your family or whatever.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And the work that it requires to make sure the neighbors like think that everything's still okay, or, that you're following this model, even when it's a challenge.
Yeah.
Okay, Adrian asked a question. I don't want to go all Max Weber here, but I was fascinated by the language codes these families had around a father's unemployment versus a mother's. Can one talk about these codes not only in terms of sexism, but also in the way male and female free time gets coded? Not lack of employment in terms of pay, but in terms of literal employment of time. He's thinking about specifically in Europe, where men's daytime idleness is coded as dangerous, as a crisis, and at times at least potentially violent.
Yeah, I think this is a really good question. And this, I think, like Alison, you had talked about how men get repackaged as ideal job seekers. And a lot of this is certainly happening. So this is partly a story of privilege, of men getting access to privilege to kind of search for a job and not having to contribute by doing, more housework or childcare. But it's also a story of a bit of a pressure to be a certain kind of a man. And that pressure really is this. So, I mean, one of the examples I think of is this one couple that whose family I observed, William and Shannon Smith. And William Smith was a pretty hands-on dad. So he was one of the, I'd mentioned like a little number about like how most of the men, when they had young kids that needed care, the kids still stayed in the daycare. Like, it's not like unemployed dads took over. So William was one of the few who did take over much of the care for his 4-year-old son at the time. But he talked about like how he went to the park with his son, like, in the middle of a weekday, and he's like, but it was like 20 moms and me. And I don't know how they were looking at me, but I certainly felt like I was this odd person out. So I became completely prickly because I was not supposed to be there. And other men also talked about like, that you can't like go out and be part of the, you can't join the PTA because there's a question as to why are you here at 10 a.m. So Darlene, who I talked about earlier, Darlene said, it was great because I went to the PTA and I could be this involved mother, like caring about Swedish fish and thinking about like the next, bake sale to raise money for the booster club or whatever. No one questioned me. No one asked me. So she said, no one asked me what I was doing at, 10 a.m. on a Wednesday, being at the school. Like, they were very welcoming. So there was also this kind of, that fathers didn't have access to these other sort of social groups where they felt sort of left out and that they had to explain their presence. So I think that's definitely something that's going on there.
Yeah, so subtle, that feeling at the playground. It's really striking. Julia says, thank you for this fascinating talk. For the first couple you spoke about on slide 3, the Box versus the Barons, I noticed that there was about a 10-year age gap between these couples. To what extent do you think age might have played a role in differing reactions to the stresses on unemployment? Did you notice the same gendered reactions to unemployment across all age groups?
Yeah, so just to address that, so this is a small qualitative non-random study, and what I had in the inclusion criteria is I needed parents that were people that were parents to dependent children. I defined dependent as 22 or younger. This is a pretty expansive definition. The reason I did 22 or younger, not the sort of more normal 18 and younger or so on, was because in this professional sort of middle class, parents are actually often economically, most often economically responsible for their kids through the duration of college education. So a lot of folks studying sort of transition to adulthood have said that the 18 mark, even though it's a legal age or whatever, doesn't make that much sense. We need to think about like to the extent that parents are actually responsible for kids. And so 22 seemed to make sense. But of course, when you have that age range, and even if you have like a parent of an 18 or a 17-year-old and a parent of like a 3-year-old, there's going to be age differences between the parents, right? And so I have people like the age range of my sample is, I think it was like some 30 something to like, I think 60 was the oldest person in the sample. That's a generational difference, essentially. It's a pretty wide range. And I did not find it to matter that much. I found even couples like, so the Bachs and the Barons, the Bachs are in their 50s and the Barons are in their 40s. But what I thought mattered more was the age of the kids at times. So especially with mothers or with more mothers with younger children under 6, that's sort of when, like, even though they wanted to job search, they often ended up not job searching very much. They were like, this is just not possible for me. I just don't have the resources. I can't justify paying for childcare, while searching for a job. Important to know that fathers of young kids did not feel that way necessarily. So basically, I think the answer I'm trying to give is that I don't think, I really mulled this around, that is this the differences that I'm seeing, is it not about gender and is it about age? And no, I really don't think that mattered very much, because even the younger families were relatively like following the pattern that I'm laying out here of not prioritizing women's job searching, of expecting women to do a lot of unpaid housework. And part of this was coming from the fact that these younger women would be at a age kind of category with kids, where kids needed a lot of attention and care. And so the financial decision families made was that this, rather than paying or outsourcing this, the mother, because she's unemployed, can take over this, which was not a decision made by families of unemployed fathers.
Somebody messaged me and I think made the interesting observation of how we talk about childcare, which is when women say childcare is a barrier to getting back to work, such as the she session, be that women in heterosexual couples just don't have the partner or nanny support. Well, husbands have all kinds of childcare support, their wives, continuing paid childcare, etc. I don't know if you have any comments on that, of how we kind of think or talk about the availability of childcare.
Yeah, husbands do have that. I mean, I agree. I think they do have that. And, it's not even just about childcare. I think there's a lot of interesting research showing that it's not about just having the childcare. It's about who's also organizing the childcare, who's anticipating when children will need to be picked up and dropped. So, when I talked about that fathers may have done more pickups and drop-offs, but they were not the ones organizing it. They were literally getting the schedule from their wives, who were setting the week that, our son has a swim meet today, our daughter has ballet, at X time. And so you're going and doing that. The mothers, so the employed wives of unemployed dads were the ones making the schedules, which dads were then following. So they weren't doing the cognitive work of organizing. That was still on the employed mothers.
Yeah, that was so striking in your research. I think it was an employed wife with an unemployed husband, and she was, the baby needs a haircut, the so-and-so needs to go to work. And you could see how complicated it is and how much time and effort that takes, yeah. All right, Agnes asks, why do you think in the families you observed, the women didn't simply ask their husbands to get their own office space and time? Do you have the impression their husbands would have refused, or were the women less vocal about their needs? Or did they not feel the need to multitask or isolate themselves in order to accomplish personal goals?
I think it was just, to me, and that's certainly the argument I've made, is that it was more the sense of, you're searching for a job is just not that important right now. You get to be the kind of mom you couldn't be before because you were doing paid work. Isn't it great that you now get to kind of, so with Darlene, for instance, she literally talked about I now get to make breakfast for my teenage son. Does he need me to make breakfast? No, but I really enjoyed it. Now, this is something I could not have done, and I want to be able to pamper him. Now, when I went back, and this is Darlene's family is one that I observed, and I also interviewed them over a period of time. And when I went back, 6 months after she'd made the statement, about 10 months after she'd lost her job, she was like, no, I don't need to be doing this for him. He needs to kind of make his own breakfast. Why am I running after him? So like the kind of, being a good mother that also dulled over time because it didn't become as fulfilling. Essentially, for a lot of mothers, this happened also where they were like, especially the ones with older kids, they were like, yeah, it was nice to pamper for a while, and now I'm over it. Now I'd please like to be involved in paid work again. But this thing that you're asking, why didn't women simply ask? But I mean, what I think a lot of the women, like Darlene, for instance, just to stick with her example, she was very sad when I asked her about like the kind of support that she got from her husband. And he's not like a mean guy or anything, but he just wasn't asking her about her job search and so on. And she was very upset that why am I not getting this emotional support? But I think getting that, I don't know how you demand that. I think what her struggle was. I don't know how to demand this because it's something I shouldn't have to ask for it. With my women friends or with she had, at that point, she had joined like a new sort of job search club, but she said they don't help me in getting new leads for a job, but it's really nice to be able to talk to other people who are in the same boat I am, because I don't get that anywhere else. But with husbands, when I talk to them, their wives were the key people that they were thrashing this out with. And by thrashing it out, I mean at an emotional level, but also practical level, right? Like sending emails to their wives to cross-check, is this an okay response as a follow-up to this job lead? Or can you, copy edit this, thank you note or whatever it is for me? Because all of those niceties become like a really important part of job searching, and wives were helping materially with that a lot, but also emotionally with that. So I think this is part of that dynamic of, so I think, Agnes, to answer your question, I think this is just more that women's searching for a job was just not framed as important. It was just downplayed. And when it's downplayed, there's no need for a home office. Right? This is not something that's urgent that needs to be done. There's no pressure or whatever, and that's how it's sort of swept under the rug. If there's no pressure, then you don't need an office space to focus on it.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. I'm sorry we're not going to be able to get to everybody's question. But for the final question, Pam asks, great research. I studied women who made a voluntary exit from the labor force, although not necessarily a preference on their part. I'm struck by similarity of experiences at home of women I studied to yours. To what extent do you think women who lost jobs were seen as opting out? Any implications if so? I also wanted to mention the study of media depiction of stay-at-home dads with Ariel Kupperberg in Gender and Society. Like, you find this as not as gender liberalizing as one might suppose.
So thank you so much for this question. I'm really honored by it also because I love your work. But just to kind of talk about the implication of this women being seen as opting out. This struck me because with Grace, for instance, when I talked with Grace in one of her follow-up interviews, she talked about how that she was still searching for jobs at the time, and she was like, but the way I'm framing it is I have a big gap on my CV. So Grace, the last time I was in touch with her, she'd been out of work for 2 years. That's a very long gap to explain, right? Like when she's trying to get a job back. And so Grace said, I think the way that I'm gonna deal with this is basically say that I, quote unquote, opted out. I don't know if she used that word, but that's the sense that's what she was getting at, to care for children, because I think that's less stigmatizing than having lost a job and not having been able to find one that suits my own needs during that time. Now and I think there were some other women who said the same thing, where they thought that kind of covering it up, having a narrative of I opted out for caregiving, as opposed to I lost a job. With unemployed men, they went for the narrative of I took early retirement, for the ones who were slightly older, where this was feasible. So this was, anyone who was sort of over 50 would say this, I took early retirement, as a way of trying to say that I didn't lose a job. That was a narrative that they tell me that they were using. Anyway, so the point is, with women, when they use this caregiving narrative, there's research showing by Kate Weisher that looks at, who's a former Stanford grad, which looks at how when people have gaps in their resumes, and if it's caregiving gaps, employers don't want to hire them. They don't want to hire them because these people are seen as deviating from the ideal worker norm, that these people will care for families more than caring for their work. So this is not someone we want to employ. So that the implication of that worries me. If unemployed women do use this as a masking narrative, I don't think this is something that's going to help them at all. I think it might, exacerbate the situation a bit more, given the stigma of caregiving and trying to get reemployed after.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Aliya, for joining us today and for sharing your incredible work with us. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. Goodbye.
Thank you.